Thank you for the introduction, and just a whole bunch of big thank yous to start off. So thank you to Zoocheck for hosting this event. The Writers Union of Canada and the Canada Council for the Arts are supporting this event. And thank you to all of you for coming. I'm very honored that you've chosen to spend the hour with me talking about creative writing and animal advocacy. And I did suggest we put in the chat where we're all joining from, and it's wonderful to see people coming from all different places around the world coming together with us here. One of the things that I wanted to do before I sort of jumped into talking was to read a poem. It's a poem that I quite love, and it's by an Indigenous storyteller named Joseph Bruchac, and I find it very heart-opening and very grounding, and I think it will just sort of set the tone for the evening. The poem is called Prayer, and this is what Joseph Bruchac writes. Let my words be bright with animals, images the flash of a gull's wing. If we pretend that we are at the center, that moles and kingfishers, eels and coyotes are at the edge of grace, then we circle dead moons about a cold sun. This morning, I ask only the blessing of the crayfish, the beatitude of the birds, to wear the skin of the bear in my songs, to work like a man with my hands. So maybe I will this evening ask for the blessing of the crayfish as well. So we're coming together to talk about writing as a tool for advocacy. And of course, writing is essential for advocacy when we think of all the sort of nonfiction writing, journalism, op-ed pieces, social media posts, websites. I can't imagine how much work Rob does doing Zoocheck, event things and blog posts and writing letters to government and letters to editors. But for me, the writing that I do is creative writing. So I write short stories, I write novels, and more recently I've started to write poetry as well. And I really feel that creative writing can be a really powerful tool in advocacy. And I think that I imagine that almost all of us could name a book or maybe multiple books that have been books that have changed us, books that have impacted us. I'm going to talk about a couple that influenced me when I was younger. And as I'm chatting, I'd love to hear in the chat if you would like to share a book that really changed you in some way. Maybe a short story that you read, maybe a children's book, maybe something that you read recently, but a piece of creative writing that really impacted you. And you know, when I think about this, I think about a book like Charlotte's Web, which is a book that people have been reading for years, that is still a very popular book, that is sometimes called one of the, best pieces of children's literature that there is. And I would love to be able to see how many people had been influenced by a book like that. Maybe their attitude towards spiders got changed. Maybe their attitudes about pigs got changed. Maybe they thought differently about using animals as food. Maybe they simply were influenced by the main character, Fern, who's this feisty girl who really loves animals. And so on that line, I'll just mention, I just recently read a biography of E.B. White, and there's a section that talks about him making an audio recording of Charlotte's Web, and he had to do multiple takes. He had to do it 17 times before he could manage to get through without crying as he read the chapter that Charlotte died in. So, I'm just seeing him as an author being changed as well. He spent a year researching spiders to write that book. And I think that his research shows in that book. And so, I'd be really curious to hear what some books are that people have read that have influenced them. Animal advocacy would be great, but it doesn't have to be related specifically to animals. It could be related to social justice movements. The two books, not books, one is a book and one is a poem, but the two pieces of writing that I wanted to mention. The first one is a book that I read as a child. And my gosh, when I was a child, I read a lot of animal books. I had so many of those sad dog stories that I read, Beautiful Joe and Old Yeller and Sounder and all of these books about dogs. I guess, I really wanted a dog, and I think I had literary dogs instead of my own dog. But one of the books that I remember reading was by Lucy Boston, and she wrote a book called A Stranger at Green Knowe. It was a series of books about Green Knowe. And in this particular one, there's a gorilla that's in captivity in the London Zoo. And it was, I think, the first book that I remember reading that actually, had a critical gaze on zoos, rather than I don't know, I'm thinking of like Curious George Goes to the Zoo, some of the sort of typical children's books where, it's a fun event going to the zoo. And this particular book really captured what it was like for this animal to be taken from the wild, taken from, their family, taken away from where their home was, where they belonged, and that real sense of losing their wildness because they were in captivity. The other one was a piece of writing I read as a teenager, which was a poem by Margaret Atwood called Dreams of the Animals. And yeah, I don't remember loving poetry that much at that age, but that particular poem really stayed with me. I loved, first of all, that it was about the dreams of animals. We still have people who say, well, we can't know that animals dream, they're not the same as us. So I love that that was sort of the doorway in. And I just loved how unique the poem was. I'm going to read it for you. And I will get on to reading some of my own writing soon, but let me share this one with you. Dreams of the animals. Mostly, the animals dream of other animals, each according to its kind. Though certain mice and small rodents have nightmares of a huge pink shape with 5 claws descending. Moles dream of darkness and delicate mole smells. Frogs dream of green and golden frogs, sparkling like wet suns among the lilies. Red and black striped fish, their eyes open, have red and black striped dreams, defense, attack, meaningful patterns. Birds dream of territories enclosed by singing. Sometimes the animals dream of evil in the form of soap and metal, but mostly the animals dream of other animals. There are exceptions. The silver fox in the roadside zoo dreams of digging out and of baby foxes, their necks bitten. The caged armadillo near the train station, which runs all day in figure eights, its piglet feet pattering, no longer dreams, but is insane when waking. The iguana in the pet shop window on St. Catherine Street, crested, royal-eyed, ruling its kingdom of water dish and sawdust, dreams of sawdust. And I just think, talking about both these pieces of writing, how much empathy I felt for the animals in these stories. And I think that's one of the very powerful things that we can do with our stories is build empathy for animals, for other people, for, the forest, the rivers, the whole living world around us. I'm going to now read in just a moment from Tizzy and Me, which is my children's chapter book, my first children's literature that's getting published. From the title, 15 Ways to Love a Mink, you can assume that it is about minks, and it's more specifically about mink fur farming. And one of the things I wanted to do before I read from it is just talk a little bit about the genesis of the story. And I always find that interesting hearing writers talk about how they came up with their ideas and how sort of inspiration for the story came into being for them. So I would say that the first seed for the story was actually a previous children's chapter book that I wrote, which was about a young gal with her 2 moms and the family adopting a dog from the Toronto Humane Society. And it was very much a picture of my own life. And so for sure, I think writing about our own lives is a wonderful way to get started with creative writing, creating a character who has your attributes or your identification, writing about experiences that you've had, maybe changing them or fictionalizing them. But it's a great place to start writing. So I did write this story when my daughters were little. There weren't a lot of stories that had same-sex families in them, and I really wanted that to be different. And I thought, well, the best way to do that is to write my own story. That one didn't get published, but the pandemic came along. And one of the things that was in the news a lot, at least the news that I get, which has a lot of animal advocacy information in it, was about mink fur farming. And about minks getting COVID, and about these mink farms having to be culled, which means all the animals were killed. And it was really hard for me to find out about that. I did know about fur farming, but when we found out about COVID and the impact of it, it seemed to me that this was like a winnable thing, that we would now realize we shouldn't be doing this. It's such a threat to human health. It's such a terrible does such terrible damage to animals. It's does damage to the environment, but we still continue to do it. And so I think I really wanted to talk about an animal issue, very narrow, very specific, that I think maybe in the next 5 to 10 years will not be an issue anymore. That's my hope anyways. And so I was doing some research around mink fur farming, and I started to think about the children's chapter book, and I thought, oh, that might be interesting to look at it from the perspective of a child who finds out about it with their sort of, you know, not being jaded, right? Not having heard about these things and maybe turning away from them, the sort of the startling first realization that this is something that happens. Anyways, I was researching it and I came across this article, 15 ways to wear a mink. And it was like, you know, fur trimmed boots, anyone? And, you know, wear the coat open. It's an avant-garde look. So, as I was reading these things, I just had this sort of surge of like, we should just subvert this. 15 ways to love a mink instead of 15 ways to wear a mink. And that really pulled everything together for me. So it's a story about this young gal with her two moms and her dog. The Tizzy is the dog, and her discovery of mink fur farming and what happens when she learns about it. I'm going to share my screen. I want to share a beautiful illustration that is a sample of what will be in the book. Let me just enlarge that for everybody. There we go. And let me get myself back to the beginning. And that's just our introductory slide. Here is this lovely, lovely picture from Alice Priestley. I have her website there. She's the illustrator for the book. She's going to do a cover and then 20 black and white pictures inside of the book. And yeah, I just thought I'd share this with you while I read a little bit from Tizzy and me. And the audience for this book is, you know, children aged 6 to 9, but you'll just have to sort of channel your inner child as I read. So let me just start at the beginning of the book. My best friend Winona's new coat. It was the first snowy day in November, and there were big snowflakes, the kind you can catch on your tongue, coming down from the sky. All the kids in the schoolyard were bundled up in their puffy coats and their big stompy boots and their pom-pom hats. My hat was orange, like a tangerine. It had a pom-pom and it had tassels. The tassels hung down like two orange braids, just like Pippi Longstockings. Sometimes when I wear that hat, I pretend that I'm Pippi, the strongest girl in the world, and that I can lift a horse up over my head. My Mama Bee, who is a librarian, read all of the Pippi Longstocking books to me. She's Mama Bee because she's my mama, and her name is Beatrice. Sometimes I call my other mum Mum J because her name is Jo, but mostly I just call her Mum. Anyways, that day I wasn't pretending that I was Pippi. Instead, I was looking for my best friend Winona. We've been best friends since we were 4 years old when we met in junior kindergarten. Now we are 7 years old and in grade 2. When I saw Winona at the playground, I ran right up to her. She had a new red coat on that was bright red, like a fire truck. Red is Winona's favorite color. She always has something red to eat in her lunch bag. Yesterday, she had pomegranate seeds. I wondered what she had today. I poked my finger into Winona's new coat and it disappeared. That's how puffy the coat was. Winona twirled around and hopped up and down and squealed. Look, she said, look how furry the hood is. She pulled the hood up over her head and I could hardly see her face. She looked like my dog Tizzy, who has brown, sticky up fur, except Winona doesn't have fur all over her body like Tizzy does. Tizzy is so furry, she even has tufts of fur sticking out between the black pads on her paws. I reached up and petted the fur on Winona's hood. It felt super soft, even softer than Tizzy's. It's real fur, that's what my dad told me, Winona said. I pulled my hand away fast. You shouldn't wear real fur, I said. Winona frowned at me. But it will keep me extra warm and it's so fuzzy. They kill animals to get fur, I said. No, they don't. Winona pulled the hood back down off her head and I could see her mad eyes glaring at me. They just take off the fur, she said. I glared back at Winona. They make them dead first, I told her. I knew about fur because Mama Bee doesn't wear things that come from animals like fur or leather, which is the skin of an animal. She doesn't eat anything that comes from animals either, like meat or eggs or milk or cheese. That means that she is vegan. You're wrong. They're not dead, Winona said. Her mad eyes were filling up with tears. I'm not wearing dead animals. She stomped her foot on the ground. You're so mean to say that to me, Georgia. And then Winona ran away and hid under the big slide. She stayed mad at me for the whole day. She was so mad she didn't say one word to me all morning. So mad that she ate lunch with Priya instead of with me, and I never found out what red thing she had in her lunch bag. So mad that at the end of the day, she left without saying goodbye to me. So that's a little taste of Tizzy and me. I'm really excited. It's going to be published in October, I believe. And so I look forward to having the book out and having not just adults like yourselves listening to it, but having it shared with the children audience. I'm really looking forward to that. So I'm also going to share something maybe more appropriate for an adult audience, which is a short story that I've written. I'm not going to read the whole story, but just a piece of it. And it's a story called Captive. I wrote it many years ago. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about how this story came into being. And way, way back when I was in my very early 20s, I listened to music of a folk singer called Frank. Frank with a PH. She was a quirky thing. And one of the songs that she sang was called The Ballad of Lucy and Ted. And it was about two polar bears in the Brooklyn Zoo that were shot dead after a young boy climbed into their enclosure, and the polar bears killed the boy, and then the polar bears were shot. And I just remember being really affected by that. That story just really stayed with me. And it just seemed like a sort of a double, triple tragedy of the polar bear being in captivity, the tragedy of these kids thinking, that they could climb in the enclosure and have some fun swimming in the moat, and ending up dead. And then the tragedy of the polar bears ending up dead as well. And then years later, I started doing some work with Zoocheck. And one of the projects that I worked on was a humane education project. And I visited classrooms and I taught kids about animals and their needs and their adaptations and their habitats. And I also talked about animals in captivity. And one of the animals that we talked about was Yuppie, the polar bear. And her story really impacted me. And, similar to the story of Lucy and Ted, I carried her story with me for a long time. Zoocheck was doing a lot of great advocacy on behalf of Yuppie. And so at some point, I just kind of wanted to get the stories, out of my ruminating thoughts and into the world. I think for me, sometimes writing about difficult things really helps me process them and release them. I thought maybe before I jumped into the story, though, I could turn things over to Rob for a couple minutes to talk a little bit about Yuppie, what Yuppie's conditions of captivity were, and what Zoocheck was doing. Zoocheck did wonderful advocacy for Yuppie, despite how things ended up turning out. Rob, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I can do that. And in fact, when I knew you were going to ask me about this, because a lot of this occurred quite a number of years ago, I actually looked up some of the sequence of events. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of a rundown of what happened with UP and what our involvement were. And that, I guess, will be a very good segue into your comments, Nadja, about your story. Yuppie was actually a young polar bear in March 1992 near Wainwright, Alaska, which is on the north shore of Alaska. She was there with a male, her brother, and her mother as well. And her mother was shot by a hunter, and the two cubs were obviously orphaned. And we don't know how old exactly they were, but the estimates range from about 3 months to 2 years old. At 2 years, they would leave the mother, or maybe a bit before that. So we don't know exactly how old they were. And they were caught by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and sent to the Alaska Zoo in Anchorage. And we actually worked many years later with Pat Lampe on moving the Toronto elephants down to California. Pat Lampe, who had sent his lone resident elephant at the Alaska Zoo down to California as well, was part of the team. But what happened is the Alaska Zoo was supposed to be a temporary sort of way station until a home was found for Yuppie. And I can't remember exactly why, but Yuppie's brother died, and Yuppie was obviously left alone. The Morelia Zoo in Mexico, and Morelia is well known to Mexicans, but not to a lot of people from the United States and Canada. A beautiful historic city about 300 kilometers west of Mexico City. And the Morelia Zoo had indicated an interest in having Yuppie as a display animal. And that's where UP ended up going, down to the Morelia Zoo. And just to give you an idea of the environment there compared to the environment that UP had experienced to some degree, because UP's life in the wild was quite short, obviously. But the average temperature in Morelia ranged from about 14 degrees Celsius to 25 degrees Celsius over the year, but it would go up to 38 Celsius, so more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. Whereas where UP came from on the North Shore of Alaska, the temperature ranged from about minus 30 Celsius in the winter to maybe about 11 degrees Celsius in the summer. So a huge differential in the types of environment, temperature-wise, that UP would have experienced. And of course, it's vast open spaces and an entirely different terrain. And anybody who looks at polar bears know that they're exquisitely adapted to live in the cold environments and these wide open spaces. Everything about them physically and behaviorally is geared towards living in that environment. Well, not only was the temperature different for UP, but UP was put first into an old grizzly bear enclosure and then into another enclosure. And they were basically concrete pits, very sort of old style types of enclosures. And the enclosure that UP ended spending most of her time in was completely walled. So it wasn't even an exhibit where UP could look out and see other things. All she could see is walls. There was no cooling of the environment. Her pool water was warm. And at night when the keepers went home, she was confined in a concrete room in the dark with nothing to do. In 2005, a foundation out of the US contacted Zoocheck and asked us to go down and have a look, and we did. And unbeknownst to us, that led to many years of working to try to help UP, and by extension, just through the campaign, there was a lot of awareness and sort of additional activity with regard to other animals and zoos generally in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. But we started off doing a report on UP. I went down, my colleague went down, and subsequent to that, we had other people go down to Mexico as well, including numerous experts. And at one point, we sent a world-class polar bear veterinary team that fixed UP's broken, rotted teeth, which had caused her excruciating pain, chronic pain for many years. So we had a number of people go down. The local groups were activated, national groups, including in Mexico City, the Green Party, other politicians. There was a lot of media, and there was a lot of negotiations with the zoo, the politicians in the city of Morelia, and in Mexico City. Well, I won't try to tell you everything because it was an extremely complicated effort that had 150 different moving parts. But I will say that, the attention on UP resulted in the zoo trying to look better. So they made some improvements. They put overhead shade cloth in. They knocked down one of the walls and put up fencing so UP could look out. They put in sprinklers for cooling. They put in a sand pit. They put in an air conditioner for her night quarters and all that. And that's all fine, but it didn't address UP's core issues. And, our campaign continued. We wanted her out of there. And we were gaining a lot of traction, especially politically, including with multiple governors of the state of Michoacan that Morelia was in. And I should mention one little sort of fun fact, if you want to call it that, is that Morelia at the time, or for much of that time, was the epicenter for the narco wars. So there were times when, our people would go down and there'd be all the soldiers in the streets with machine guns and that, and bombs had gone off and all that. So it was at times a volatile place, even though at other times it was very quiet, and it was just a beautiful city. So eventually everything worked out, and a plan was made to transfer UP to a very large facility in the United Kingdom called the Yorkshire Wildlife Park. So agreements were signed and everything was working to UP's advantage. We shipped a crate from Canada down to the Morelia Zoo. We hired a trainer that we work with out of Texas. She's known around the world. She went down, lived in Morelia for a period of time to train Yuppie to go into the crate. It was thought it might take 6 or 8 weeks. It took 1 day, and then Yuppie was trained. Yuppie would just go in the crate, so very quick. And a lot of things happened, a lot of back and forth, a lot of politics. And as we were getting nearer, in fact, it was just 2 weeks until Yuppie was to be flown to the United Kingdom. The governor at that time pulled out of the agreement due to zoo industry pressure. Now, one would think that's the end of or the loss of all hope for Yuppie, but there was something that was very interesting, and the story ends very shortly, Nadja. I don't want to take all your time, but I think it is an interesting story. We uncovered a permit with the help of the Alaska Zoo that hadn't been seen in more than 20 years. I think it was 25 years no one had seen it. And it was the permit issued by U.S. Fish and Wildlife that basically said Yuppie would go to Morelia, but was still owned by the United States. And that allowed us to then push U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and there were a lot of things going on in the United States, and PROFEPA, the Mexican Science Agency, and they were getting ready to finally go in and take Yuppie from the zoo and take her back initially to the United States. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Mexican authorities were getting ready to act, and then on November 12, 2018, the zoo announced that somehow Yuppie had passed away. The body was never made available. There was no necropsy or anything else, so take what you will from that. I think if you're thinking that maybe this wasn't entirely an accident, that would be probably fair to think, but we don't know for sure. But that's Yuppie's story. It's a tragic ending, but a lot that went on, and that gives you an idea of Yuppie's life. So there you go.
Thanks, Rob. And you were sharing things that I didn't realize, some of the things I didn't know. I didn't know how close she was to being moved with the crate and everything. So, kudos to Zoocheck for persevering through all of that and all the challenges of that. And although Yuppie never did get moved, I think there was a lot of awareness raised about the issues of, animals like polar bears in captivity and how horrendous that can be for them. So let me go ahead and I'm just going to share a picture of Yuppie while I share the opening of the short story that I wrote about not just her. I mean, it's a polar bear based on her, but it's not Yuppie. But also combining that story of the kids that went into the enclosure of a polar bear. So here's Yuppie in the hot Mexican sun in that barren enclosure. You can see the concrete wall. You can see the stump that is the enrichment, which is, really kind of bleak. So let me begin this story. Captive. The boy wakes early, excited about going to the zoo with his older brother. He has never been before, and his brother has promised he will see a polar bear. He doesn't question why he will be going instead of his little brother, who is everyone's favorite, just like he doesn't question which of the 5 brothers his father will raise a hand to when he's angry, or whose chest the old cinnamon-colored cat will curl up on at bedtime. He has learned these kinds of questions are pointless. Yesterday, his older brother had shown him a YouTube video of a great white bear dragging a seal out of the water, tugging it forward across the snow with a flipper gripped in its enormous canine teeth. This boy knows nothing of snow, nothing of these ice bears. His life in Michoacan is filled with the scuttle of emerald-eyed lizards glittering in the hot sun, with dusty feral dogs lying under the broad leaves of the fig trees, panting in the heat. At the end of the video, the seal was half-eaten, and the polar bear had a bloody red goatee on his chin. The boy had clapped his hands, delighted by the ferocity. The white bear is asleep, splayed out like a starfish on the concrete floor, dreaming. She dreams smells, the biting wind carrying the scent of salted waves, the rank fishy odor of a ringed seal's exhale, the faint milky whiff of her mother. Her body remains flat and motionless, but her wide black nostrils flare. Another smell enters the dream, the pungent aroma of a dead bowhead whale washed ashore and rotting on a beach. In the dream, she lifts her head, black nose to the wind, and inhales, tracking the scent. Her mother calls her with a gruff bark, and she and her brother run forward across a rocky stretch of coastal tundra, the smaller rocks scraping and clattering underneath their feet. Her front paw twitches, the enormous claws scraping against the concrete. The boy stands pressed against the smooth metal rail that crowns the waist-high chain-link fence, looking down at the bear. Within the fence, there is a thick line of bushes, then a low concrete wall, which drops vertically to create the pit that encloses the bear. The boy bounces up and down on his toes, clutching the bar that encircles the concrete pit as he leans forward to scan the enclosure, waiting for something to happen. This flat, motionless bear is not what he was expecting. It's not even white, he thinks, squinting his eyes against the noonday sun as he studies the bear. Her fur, which is a grimy yellow, is tinged green with algae and hangs loosely on her bony frame. The enclosure that the boy is staring down into, at first glance, looks like a stark Arctic landscape. The white concrete floor could be a small expanse of sea ice. It is not entirely flat. It has small dips and gullies, as if the ocean has heaved up against it. There are several bright blue circular patches on the floor that are meant to represent icy water, breathing holes in the pack ice where a seal's whiskered snout might appear, the flattened nostrils slitted shut, popping wide open for an inhale. The tall walls that surround the enclosure have been sprayed with rough gunite and painted white. They are meant to look like the towering walls of a deep glacier crevice. The sun beats down, illuminating the illusion. The exhibit is not completely barren. There is a dead tree rising up near one edge of the enclosure. Its lower half is encased in concrete and hot wired to prevent the bear from climbing it. Near the middle of the enclosure, there is a thick stump, smaller than the bear in height, leaning slightly to the left. At the other end of the enclosure, the floor begins to slope down, its gradual incline leading to a small, narrow pool, still and blue, sparkling with little flashes of reflected sunlight. The boy wipes the beads of sweat from his forehead and scratches his armpit. It is hotter than normal, and there's no shade in or around the bear's exhibit. His older brother, who hates staying still, has wandered off. The boy has been here watching the bear for 6 minutes. The bear that he is looking down at has been here in this tropical zoo enclosure for 23 years. She's well loved by the locals who visit, even though she is no longer the little Osita that arrived so many years ago, all the way from Alaska after mother was shot by hunters. They like to watch her from below through the thick glass wall that allows them to watch her swim past in the pool, her wide paws paddling effortlessly through the water, volleys of air bubbles streaming from her nostrils. A few other visitors pass by the boy. They glance down at the lifeless bear, shrug, and walk off. The tropical birds are more popular today, the toucans clattering their orange beaks, the long-necked flamingos preening in the sun. "Wake up, you stupid bear," the boy mutters, glaring at the inert white animal. She doesn't even look alive, he thinks. She looks like a dirty bearskin rug. He wishes he were close enough to give the bear a sharp shove to awaken her, like he sometimes does with his little brother. He looks around and spots a small rock underneath the flowering purple flowers that line the walkway around the enclosure. The boy picks it up, tossing it lightly in his hand, assessing its heft. Kindness is not natural for this boy. He has received little of it, so offers little back. He has 3 older brothers, each who torments the younger ones. He has a father who simmers with rage. His mother provides for him, but has long ago ran out of small kindnesses. Then there are the boys at school who have chosen him as the target of their bullying. It is not clear why this has happened. He's not stupid or not slower, not uglier than the others, yet something about him has marked him as different. And so they leave him out of the recess soccer games. They tease him relentlessly about his crooked front teeth. They call him a coward because he once refused a dare. And sometimes they push him down in the playground, and their sharp-knuckled fists pummel his softest spots. He glances round furtively, but the young couple that have been nearby, holding hands and whispering to each other, not even looking down at the bear, have strolled away. He reaches back his left arm and with careful aim, lets the rock fly down towards the bear. The rock misses its mark and skitters to a stop near the bear's long muzzle. The bear's head jerks back and she opens her eyes. And I'm going to stop sharing there. So that's, I think, just maybe the first like 3 pages of the story. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, well, there's lots of things I want to talk about, and we're going to run out of time, but I wanted to talk a little bit about getting this story published. And it was just published not that long ago, even though I wrote it quite some time ago. And one of the things that happened was I had submitted it to a literary journal, a Canadian literary journal. And generally, if you don't get accepted, you get sort of a form letter. But I got a personal rejection letter. And I want to read it to you just because I found it very fascinating and frustrating. And so my rejection letter reads, "Dear Nadja, thank you for submitting Captive. We appreciated the chance to read it. Unfortunately, after careful consideration, we find that we are unable to publish it. We thought you might like to know that jurying on this one took it all the way to our long list of final works for consideration. That's why you're hearing from us a little later than anticipated. The piece really stimulated our reading committee. They loved the writing itself, and it was a tough call that in the end came down to a feeling that your portrayal of the zoo itself is overly bleak. You may feel otherwise, but we did a bit of reading on how polar bears are kept, and the conditions seem quite a bit more humane." And then they attached a link to the Association of Zoos and Aquariums for me to learn more about polar bears in captivity. And one of the things that was so frustrating about that is the how little meaning having AZA accreditation actually means. And Rob, I know we don't have too much time, so maybe just like a minute or so, if you just want to explain to people what the problems with AZA and CAZA, which is the Canadian Association for Zoos and Aquariums. So, you know, for them to send that off to me as a way for me to learn more and to understand that animals being kept in captivity are being treated really well and their needs are being met, that seemed to be what was implied there.
Well, that's certainly a narrative that the zoo industry itself has been pushing for quite a number of years. In fact, they go back decades pushing this idea that they're the experts, that they're humane, that they are engaged in activities that are actually beneficial for these animals as a species and all of that. But I think if you look, and polar bears are actually a good example, because if you were to pick a group of animals that are probably amongst the worst candidates for life in captivity, polar bears would be in that group. They're wide-ranging, they're extremely active, intelligent, you know, all the check boxes that you would want if you were listing an animal that is inappropriate for captivity would be checked, or most of them would be if you looked at polar bears. But it's you know, true that there have been marginal improvements in the way that some polar bears in some zoos are kept, but the core fundamental issues that they face remain completely unaddressed. The conditions are small, they're behaviorally impoverished, polar bears are in the wrong climates, and that's manifested in zoos right across the country. You can go to the best known zoos in the world, like the San Diego Zoo, and it's awful how they treat their polar bears. And there's so many other examples everywhere that polar bears are kept. So they've gained a lot of traction with their narrative, but I wish people would do their due diligence and check out to see if those things are true. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't. Some have good reasons, some don't. But I wish everybody did their due diligence before they just accepted what an industry who would benefit by keeping these animals says.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you know, the fact that the comment was that, the story, the captivity was too bleak. I think that was the whole point that I wrote the story, because of how bleak it was and because of the, incredible suffering of this animal. And one of the things that I was hoping to do in this story is to kind of like the poem at the beginning, Joseph Bruchack's poem about us being at the center. So for this story, I really didn't want the human character to be at the center. I wanted sort of this equal balance between the young boy and the polar bear as the two, on the same plane, these two characters on the same plane, each with their own journey. I will let you know where that story is published if you are interested in reading to the end. It is very bleak, though, I have to be honest. But before, I'm going to share some slides with some resources around publishing and such, but I just wanted to quickly swap to the chat because some of the books that people have mentioned are just look so amazing. And there's quite a few that I haven't read, so I'm quite excited to. Grizzly Heart by Charlie Russell's and Maureen Enns. Last of the Curlews, Barry, yeah, that is you. I was going to say, I know that book and I've read it and really loved it as well. The Narnia books, of course. Prayers from the Ark by Rumer Godden. I know Rumer Godden, but I'm not sure I remember that book, so I'm going to have to look that up. And Axolotl by Julio Cortazar, a short story with a man exchanging places with an axolotl exhibited in a small aquarium. This sounds fascinating. I'm really looking forward to that. A Language Older Than Words by Derek Jensen, Black Beauty, of course. So we all have these books that really have impacted us and made us maybe think a little bit differently, maybe develop some empathy. And I just quickly wanted to talk about that aspect of creating writing as advocacy. I think that storytelling is a very powerful tool. And I think one of the very first and obvious things is that sometimes it's an opportunity to educate and inform people. And I don't mean it in like a moralistic or didactic kind of way, but just exploring an issue, exploring a culture, exploring a situation in a way that allows people to learn something that maybe they never realized or didn't know. And I think that's what I was trying to do with the story Captive. Creating empathy, I think, is a huge part of what our creative writing can do. You know, we're given an opportunity to become another character, to become another person, to sort of be inside their skin, whether it's a young boy or a polar bear. And I think that empathy element for me is one of the big things that I find really impacts me. And again, we want to create that empathy without, being overly emotional. For the writers in the group, a lot of times when we first write, we do write with too much emotion. And when we pull back a little bit, it makes the story more powerful. So that's something to consider. I think one of the things that I really love is stories that maybe envision a different relationship with our more than human world, maybe envision a different or better future. I know there's a lot of like dystopian books and post-pandemic stories and post-apocalyptic worlds, but there are also stories that maybe are a bit more hopeful. And I think, I think it's a failure of imagination to only imagine these terrible endings. I think we can also think about other ways that the future may turn out. I'm thinking of a book, oh gosh, Becky Chambers. It's a short novel called A Psalm for the Wild Built. And it's about robots that gain consciousness, but then they're freed. And it's just a very gentle story. It's a sustainable culture. And it's just really interesting to read a story like that because we do see a lot more to the other side. I think our stories can be empowering, empowering people to take action. I hope that my Tizzy and Me story will be that kind of story. I don't want to give away the whole story, but Georgia and her best friend Winona eventually make up, and they both become very concerned about minks. And with the help of some adults in their world, they're able to take action on behalf of the minks. And it's a sweet story. There's a lot of the story that is not just about, minks and mink fur farming. It's, about family life, and it's about making mistakes, and it's about asking for help, and it's about learning new things. So there's a lot of, things that carry the plot forward. But, it does end with 15 ways to love a mink, and there's really wonderful suggestions of ways that people can do that. Just one sec. Sorry, my mouth was getting dried out there. All right. And then I think, our creative writing can just be really engaging, really engaging and entertaining. And especially once we start really developing animal characters that are authentic, that are three-dimensional, that are carriers of the plot, not just, sort of a side gig or something that, helps the human character change and develop, but the animals themselves can change and develop and, have plot lines that are about their lives. I'm going to share the screen, mindful that we want to do some questions at the end. But I do want to share, sorry, I'm just trying to find my slide here. Give me one sec. There we go. We're back to Yuppie. So I'm very grateful that my story was published. Captive was published in About Place Journal. And they had an issue called The More Than Human World. Lovely artwork by Rebecca Clark, which you're seeing here. It was edited by Nicole Brown, who is a fantastic poet who writes many, many animal pieces. So yeah, it was included in the section called Mercy, and I'm very grateful that it found a home here, and I think this is probably a better home than the magazine that rejected me anyways. In terms of thinking and writing about animals, I wanted to just put out there something that I do, which is I read a lot of nonfiction about animals. I read a lot of fiction as well, but I really love diving into these stories where I learn all about, the incredible, amazing worlds that animals occupy. The one I read most recently was Bitch, and this was a fantastic book, so much that I didn't know. And it was really about the limiting definition of what it is to be female in terms of animal species, and how there are many species that defy those definitions. And I love books that are about, creating creative animals and animals grieving, doing things that, science sometimes dismisses animals from doing, and thinks that only humans are capable of doing. One of the things that I do when I'm writing about animals is I do an incredible amount of research. And one of my favorite series of books is the Animal series by Reaction Books. They're great little books. They're not just natural history. They talk about myth and storytelling and our relationship with the animals. They're written by all different authors who are specialists and know these animals really well. They're really entertaining. They're filled with pictures and stuff. So I highly recommend them just for the value of reading. But if you're researching, just check and see if the animal that you're interested in, if they have done that animal, because they've done many. This is just a sample of some of them. For the writers in the group, in terms of getting published, if you're just looking for literary magazines, this is a link to the Canadian literary magazines, and I think you'd be surprised to find out how many there actually are. So that's a great place to start if you're looking to publish. But I did want to focus in more on 3 organizations. Ecolit Books is the first one, and if you go on their site, you'll find that they have literary outlets for environmental writing, and so it's nice, it's niche. You can find all sorts of different magazines, not just Canadian. This is American based, so American, but not just American. They have different outlets all over the world, and they often have themed issues coming out. And then this is just a wealth of information. If you look down at the menu there, you can see there's podcasts you can look for, advice if you're writing animal rights fiction, residencies that you can go on. So all sorts of wonderful opportunities. The next one is Orion magazine. It's a beautiful color magazine filled with art and literature. And they publish the magazine, but they also offer really great writing courses. The one I recently was interested in was eco poetry. So keep your eye on that as well if you're interested in developing your craft a little bit with others who are like-minded. And then finally, I'm going to mention Ashland Creek Press. They have this book, Writing for Animals. It's a series of essays, all by different authors, about how we can change our perspective on how we've been portraying animals in literature. So I really recommend that if you're writing about animals as well. They also have an online writing program that you can take, and they publish these anthologies of short stories. Most recently was Among Animals 3. And then finally, I'm going to share this little slide, which is just about me. Here's my novel, The Napaway Motel. I wouldn't say it's animal advocacy, but one of the things I did was I threw in a vegan character, and I just love doing that kind of thing where, this book isn't advocating for veganism, but we just have this, character who is a vegan, and we learn a little bit about their life and who they are. I have a short story that's in Among Animals 3, and then I do have several short stories that are available online, and you can just access those through my website.